Hi, boys and girls. It's casual reality story time with your host, Safe Hudson. First, off to Timmy's house, where Mom just called everyone in for dinner. Dad ambles through the back door and kicks off his boots.
Thanks for taking care of the yard work. I wish I could help,
says Mom in an appreciative tone. I got you, babe. To each their equal measure of labor, Dad replies, holding up his arms to notate the sweat and grass on his biceps. At that moment, Billy rips down the hall and sock slides into the dining room, barely stabilizing himself as he leaps into his chair. We've discussed you diving in your mother's furniture, Billy.
Well, yeah,
Billy exclaims.
But Timmy clambers all over everything as he pleases.
And being 4, Timmy has trouble even getting onto chairs. I would prefer to not have to tell you again, Dad retorts.
Yes, sir,
Billy says, as he goes silent and patiently waits to pray and be bidden to partake. In the meanwhile, Timmy has been reconfiguring himself into a semi-orderly seated position on his step-up chair. Mom sets the last vessel of food down and slips gently into her seat. At Dad's motion, they bow, pray, and dig in. Dad declines a biscuit in lieu of a large chunk of sourdough, and Billy asks if he can have the abandoned pastry. Dad sees the biscuit, but Timmy starts to cry out that he wanted it.
Meh, I wanted the biscuit. While this family practices the equality of coming together to partake of the sustenance Dad worked so hard to provide us, there is no inequity in your older brother getting it, especially as you haven't even touched yours yet,
Mom responds. Timmy obeys fervently and takes a large bite out of his biscuit to show he's very interested in it. Not long into the meal, Billy asks if he can vacate the table and play some video games before bed, after he finishes his broccoli, of course. With a reminder that his screen time is limited to an hour, he is released from the table, but not without an outcry from Timmy once again.
Meh, I want to play video games. If I recall correctly, you declined to clean your room, unlike Billy, and instead chose to go outside and play earlier today. Thus, for the sake of equity, you may not play games, and you must clean your room,
Mom chides gently. After finishing dinner and cleanup, Timmy scampers to his room in a vain attempt to clean it up in time to play video games before bed. Perhaps you've heard through the grapevine, there's a cadre of people who want to tear apart relationships, mental stability, families, possibly even the country. No, definitely the country. I would like to go over some of the ways how they want to do that, the premises behind it, the history behind the country and what they're doing, and the interrelation of Juneteenth, July 4th, and slavery. And of course, I'm meaning world slavery, not just U.S. slavery. And hopefully some of this will help you understand what is being said to you in context, because people are using the correct words, but they're using them in euphemistic forms. So we're going to start with definitions, and I'm going to use the American Heritage Dictionary 5th edition because I don't trust Merriam-Webster anymore. For things like the addendum of the definition of male as having a gender identity that is opposite of female. So female can identify as a male. And then you have also the definition of transsexual, which they've basically cut out and replaced it with transgender and the definition of transgender, and just annotated underneath the definition of transgender. Transsexual is a dated term that is sometimes used in self-reference, but that may give offense to others when used. Which all of that, of course, makes sense because people are realizing you can't change your sex. But you can, under the fluid entitlement of gender, be one of 9,000 different things. Like Demi Lovato, who recently stopped using her they-them pronouns because she was tired of explaining to people how being multiple people was an actual thing. So she just gave up on it because, of course, it doesn't make sense. If at any point you hear a thumping, that's actually Noah Webster. He has rolled over in his grave. He is trying to punch his way out of his grave to track down and throttle the Merriam brothers, except that he's a little late and they're all dead. So to start with the American Heritage Dictionary 5th edition definitions, I'm going to go with equality first, and that is the state or quality of being equal, which if you're talking under the law, of course that makes sense. You want the equal ability for every single person, no matter what. You want them to be able to go out, work hard, earn money, and buy a home, for example. Then you have equity, the state or quality of being just and fair. Well, under that definition, is it just and fair for every single person to have a house? Especially under the guise that if they don't want to get out and work and earn and pay for their home, that somebody else should pay for it for them. That's not very just or fair to anybody. And then you have racism, The belief that race accounts for differences in human character or ability, and that a particular race is superior to others. That's not just a white or Western thing, as many people would have you believe, as Thomas Sowell continues to remind that everyone, everywhere, owns slaves. So China, they own their own slaves. Mongolia, Africa, South America, the Aztecs and Mayans, they killed a lot of their own people, or made them work for them. And then, of course, Native Americans, that everybody likes to ignore. They were very warlike. They captured people. They made them slaves. So as a little bit of a backup to that, I'm going to read a passage from a book from 1859 called The History of All Nations by S.G. Goodrich. I do actually physically have a copy of this book, but I did include a link to the online archived version so you can actually reference it yourself. So in chapter 310, on page 661, it states, "In ancient Greece and among the Phoenicians, kidnapping for slaves was as common as piracy and trade. Homer tells us the fate of a captured city in 1200 BC, which keep in mind is 3,223 years ago. That's a little longer than Western slavery, maybe. He states, quote, "The men are killed, the city burned, the women and children of all ranks carried off for slaves," unquote. Keep in mind this is Homer the author, historian, not Homer the jaundiced donut connoisseur. The book continues, "In the earliest legislation of the Greeks, slaves are considered a matter of course, and few of the ancients imagined a state of society, past, present, or future, where slavery did not exist. On the island of Aegina, with an area of 42 square miles, there existed 470,000 slaves. In Corinth, 460,000. Throughout Greece, the free seem to have been to the slave as 1 to 4. So there you see that unlike the narrative, slavery has been around the world in all segments of society and history for a long, long time. At least 3,223 years. Before we get into some of the historical readings that point out the flawed ideology floating around in these tumultuous times, I'd like to go over 2 or 3 different things that are rather odd. So to start, there's this article by Politifact, and it's a fact-checking thing on a meme. The meme states, at the peak of slavery in 1860, only 1.4% of Americans owned slaves. What your history books don't tell you is that 3,000 blacks owned a total of 20,000 slaves the same year. So Politifact fact-checked this as false. But in the article, they kind of defeat themselves because they cite historian Carter G. Woodson, who found that in 1830 a total of, quote, 3,776 free Negroes owned 12,907 slaves, unquote. Politifact then goes on to say that with 3 more decades of population growth, it's plausible that the number of black-owned slaves could have grown to 20,000 by 1860, historians told us. So right there, Politifact is saying, yeah, that's true, but they split their argument into 2 segments. So the meme says 3,000 blacks owned 20,000 slaves. Okay, but the other part is, at the peak of slavery, only 1.4% of Americans owned slaves. Now, Politifact says, quote, "In reality, far more than 1.4% of families in slaveholding state, the most reasonable way to measure it, owned slaves. The number was between 20 and 25%, and in some states, the rate was twice as high." But that's not what the meme said. The meme said 1.4% of Americans. And they go on to cite that because it was illegal in some states, that people couldn't have them, indicating that those people in those states that it was illegal in would have slaves if they could. However, they're not taking into consideration that under the Democratic Republic, you elect people and tell them, represent us, we don't want slavery, and then they ban slavery. So you can't take out those people and their will because that's how the country is set up. So again, Politifact is using an extremely flawed logic, and that's pretty accurate, actually. It's pretty accurate by what they present in their fact check as false. Moving on to an abstract article by Bernard R. Ortiz de Montellano. He says, quote, "A component of the Afrocentric movement has incorporated a theory that black people, including ancient Egyptians, have superior mental, physical, and paranormal powers because they have more melanin both in their skin and in their brains. By extension, it is also claimed that black people have more melatonin and beta-melanocyte-stimulating hormone in their systems, and that these compounds also contribute to the superiority of people of color over whites." He continues later on to say, "The main problems posed by this ideological movement are that it will increase the already rampant scientific illiteracy in this country, it will contribute to further widening the gap between the races, and most importantly, it is being introduced into the public school curriculum under the guise of multicultural education," which of course we can see currently happening in these times, which makes sense. This is a fairly recent article. Wait, no, it's not. It's 1993. So this has been pervasive for quite some time now. Next up is facinghistory.org that states in 1654, quote, white planter Robert Parker secured the freedom of Anthony Johnson's servant John Casor, who had convinced Parker and his brother George that he was an illegally detained indentured servant. Anthony later fought the decision. After lengthy court proceedings, Casor was returned to the Johnson family in 1865. So what's being alleged in this article is that Anthony Johnson, some people seem to purport him as the first slave owner in the country. Now, I did a little bit of research, and I'm not seeing that, because he came over as an indentured servant himself and earned his freedom. But there really seems to be no evidence that he was the first slave owner, because he came over as a slave, which means somebody else owned slaves, possibly the first slave buyer, except that he was probably bought, so that's probably not correct. So maybe, and this is probably seemingly the most likely, the first black slave owner to buy his own slaves. And I believe Anthony Johnson actually had in total about 7 slaves. But while facinghistory.org tries to make out that only white supremacists use Anthony Johnson as an example of it's not just the whites, it's pretty blatantly put forth in the article that it's not just the whites. And not only is it not just the whites, but he actually fought to get his slave back when the court took it away from him because of the workings of Robert Parker, the neighboring white farmer who freed Casor, but the court shut it down. Interestingly enough, I've heard economists talk about a theory that the country itself, developmentally, industrially, would actually have been much more accelerated had there not been slavery. So that's something interesting to muddle over. People were fighting for it, and yet they didn't even realize that in having everybody be free, the slaves would have the ability to use their own mind and strength and willpower to actually increase production, invent things, develop new processes, etc. So now to the history. In 1852, Frederick Douglass gave a speech that was entitled, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" It's a pretty good question in 1852, as they were enslaved, and the 4th of July is celebrating freedom in the U.S. So reading some snippets from this speech, as it is 3 sections, we'll start in segment 1, where Frederick Douglass says, quote, "Pride and patriotism, not less than gratitude, prompt you to celebrate and to hold it in perpetual remembrance. I have said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. So indeed, I regard it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, and at whatever the cost. Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men, too, great enough to give fame to the great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. They love their country better than their own private interests, and, though it is not the highest form of human excellence, all will concede that it is a rare virtue, and that when it is exhibited, it ought to command respect. How circumspect, exact, and proportionate were all of their movements. How unlike the politicians of an hour. Their statesmanship looked beyond the passing moments and stretched away in strength into the distant future. They seized upon eternal principles and set a glorious example in their defense. Mark them." Now I'm going to go over that real quick and break it down a little bit. He is saying that all the pride, all the celebration, all the patriotism, and no less, the Declaration of Independence, which he puts as the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny, i.e. something that connects 2 chains together. That's what a ring bolt is. And so very much he regards it as extremely important and primary to the country, even being able to hold together and continue. He's telling the people listening, the principles in the Declaration of Independence are extremely important. Celebrate them and keep them. Do whatever you have to do to keep them. He's also saying that the establishers of the country are great men. They're brave men. They show great virtue, and they ought to command respect. He says they love the country better than their own private interests, and that is an extraordinarily rare virtue. These guys weren't perfect. They had their flaws. They had their issues. Everybody does. But these guys were definitively a step above the average bear, and it should be recognized. He goes on to say that unlike the putzes that are wandering around the Capitol at this time, they have an all-encompassing view. It's very exacting. It's proportionate. They're putting a lot of time and thought into all the things that they do. That is their movement. And that they're basing all this off eternal principles. The second segment starts with the title of the speech itself. Quote, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than other days of the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons at thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. Which, if you actually know anything about history, he's pretty much 100% correct. Section 3, he continues, quote, I differ from those who charge this baseness on the framers of the Constitution of the United States. It is a slander upon their memory, at least, so I believe. There is not time now to argue the constitutional question at length, nor have I the ability to discuss it as it ought to be discussed. Let me ask, if it is not somewhat singular that if the Constitution were intended to be, by its framers and adopters, a slaveholding instrument, why neither slavery, slaveholding, nor slave can anywhere be found in it? So he's saying there that even in the time of slavery, not to mention right now, BLM, there are people who frame the founders and the writers of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution as having embedded slavery in these documents, founded the country on slavery. And that, of course, direct from a man who lived through the entirety of the major times of slavery and the Civil War, and who, by the way, if you don't know, Frederick Douglass was a slave himself. He is saying that our founding documents were not slave-holding instruments. So the people that are saying, oh, it's in the Constitution, he's saying they're full of crap. That's what he's saying, in a very kind and oratory fashion. To continue on, the next document I have is an 1897 book by Peter Thomas Stanford titled The Tragedy of the Negro in America. Thomas Stanford, throughout this book, which, by the way, is relatively short. It's about 230 pages. I have a link to it. You can read it yourself. Took me about 3.5 hours to read. It's a little bit complex on the verbiage he uses, but you can tell that he's pouring his entire soul into this book. It's all over the pages. And if you don't get a little misty-eyed at some point, then you're a complete sociopath or a leftist. But he likes to use the terminology of unauthorized and authorized tragedies. And to define that, we'll go with a hurricane, an unauthorized tragedy. Nobody starts a hurricane. It just kind of starts on its own. And an authorized tragedy, we'll use 9/11. While this book does detail in extreme graphic manner, the only thing that I found missing myself is the context of tribal warfare and enslavement around the world and throughout history. He's very, very focused on European and American slave trade, but he doesn't really include a whole lot about how the African tribes were enslaving each other, and then they found a way to sell them off at a later date. He also doesn't seem to mention anything about the American Indians and how they were doing all of this before slaves were actually brought over from Africa. Not that, again, any of this is good, correct, right, but that does give some context. So some of the segments from this book will start, quote, Man is one the whole world over, and consists of a single species. He is distinguished from the animals beneath him by conscience, reason, and speech, and is so marvelously endowed that he can adapt himself to every known climate. His intelligence has taught him how to protect himself from the cold of the north, and to endure the heat of the south. He may be found in every climate, from the hottest to the coldest, in vast forests, in regions of fertility, in wastes of sterility, in valleys and in mountains he finds a home, and makes the earth provide him food and shelter. But man is not the same in stature, intelligence, and color in every place. Diversity obtains most prominently, but color is the most noticeable feature of difference. His skin is black, yellow, olive, tawny, white, but he is man, qualified for the highest efforts of mind and the holiest act of worship. Whether black or white, educated or uneducated, he is the same creature in his feelings, and has ideas of a state after death, of a supreme power, of guilt, of pardon, which vary according to his state of enlightenment. The saying that God hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all face of the earth has been abundantly established as a truism all over the world, particularly by the rising of several savage tribes to the average level of educated nations. The ancestry of mankind is one ancestry, and man everywhere is the child of a divine father and is destined for all eternal life, and nations ought to cultivate sentiments of peace and goodwill. It is the duty of the learned to teach the unlearned, the strong to help the weak, and they that have knowledge of God and are conscious of his sustaining grace and love are under the heaviest obligation to rescue from wretchedness, guilt, and impurity those who are ignorant and depraved, that the identity of man be perfect. So to break that down, it's pretty simple. Man is very adaptable, and that no matter the color, race, different heights, different intellectual levels, different skills come out in all forms. He's also saying that man is designed to worship God, and that Christianity has actually brought up nations that were ignorant or depraved. To continue on, quote, In America, which is known as the land of the free, whose people are rightly proud of a history that speak of a noble, victorious struggle against tyranny, of the wisdom, foresight, and piety of the founders of the states, of the marvelous energy which transformed vast plains and forests into fields of wealth, creating grain and fruit, built cities, established manufactures, and made a large sphere of art and science. A long and revolting tragedy has been in progress, in which the Negro has suffered indescribable misery and been afflicted with diabolical torture. This also was a tragedy authorized by the powers that were, was recognized and defined by law, and endorsed and supported not by a few churches and religious teachers. So as with Douglas, Stanford is saying America's awesome. Foundationally great, it's done a lot of different stuff, it still has a lot of potential. But also as with Douglas, he is abusing those who set up laws and structures that are enabling slavery in the country, and which he ends there by calling out the churches and religious teachers that under the guise of some sort of necessity or even Christianity, they themselves are upholding slavery. Again, we see him using the term authorized here. Quote, "This authorized tragedy of the states, whose sufferer was the poor Negro, was always abhorred by pious men and righteous citizens, and eventually aroused the natural good feeling of the multitude, who together swept it away and prevented the country from sliding into immeasurable disgrace and calamity." If you don't know, definitionally, pious means the earnest compliance in the observation of religion. So what Holy's saying is that there's a lot of pious people and righteous citizens who were always against the slavery. But the people in power enabled it and allowed it to continue, even against the will of the people. Which makes sense, as you remember, because only 1.4% of Americans owned slaves. If the people in the states that it was illegal in wanted to own slaves, all they had to do is move across the state border and then buy themselves some slaves. So a very small amount of people even had the desire to own slaves. And here he's saying the majority of the people, especially those the pious, did not like slavery. There's also a large segment of the book on John Brown and Harper's Ferry. Stanford actually cites John Brown as being one of the pivotal tilting points that led into the Civil War, because it caused so much uproar and outrage. It was all over the news at the time, that basically his actions and his death leading from his actions made the people of the country see that there could be something done about this, that which they abhorred so much, and so people started to move against slavery. Furthermore, he says, quote, "Let England and America, then, as we know them today, be in no sense blamed for the fixing of a slave system in the States. Both countries have paid in money and in blood the price of the sin of dead generations, and are the greatest hope of mankind. In a holy rivalry, they hold up the torch of civilized light, spread on every hand the beneficence of business, display before all nations the safety and solidity of national life based on the free vote of their peoples, and send forth missionaries at immense cost to all who are in the darkness of ignorance." Now, in the first sentence there, fixing is actually designing or setting up of a slave system. So he's saying, don't blame England and America for setting up a slave system in the States. It's not England or America as a country. It's specific few people who, with either hatred or disregard in their hearts, again, culminating in about 1.4% of Americans, thought that owning slaves and slavery was a good idea. Interestingly enough, along the way in the book, he actually cites that there were multiple states that wanted to quell or completely ban slavery altogether long before the Civil War. So this wasn't something that just continued on and everyone was just sitting around going, golly gee, this is bad. There were attempts in 1712, 1726, 1760, 1771, 1774, 1784 in Pennsylvania, Virginia, South Carolina, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island in various ways to at least quell the flow of the slave trade. Now, the next segment is extremely interesting because a lot of people get it wrong in history, and they put a lot of twisted information to make it seem like Abraham Lincoln was kind of wishy-washy. On that, he says, quote, "From the president, Lincoln, it appeared not much might be expected. Some said he was a coward. Others thought him lacking in sympathy for the slave, and even a few of his friends were afraid that he had no disposition to act as the anti-slave party desired and requested him. They were all wrong. Upon him rested a responsibility greater than ever borne by any president of the United States, not excepting Washington, and he knew it, and allowed neither individual nor society to hurry him out of his path of duty. He knew the power of the slave party and the spirit of the slave system, and all through the long struggle waited for the guidance of God." So there, Stanford is actually calling President Lincoln a pious man, that even though people doubted him, and in some ways were working against him or trying to work around him, he was wise enough to take things step by step, to see all the sides he possibly could, to understand the ravenous push and power of the slave party and the spirit of the system itself as it was set up. And he was checking all options along the way, which of course any good leader is going to do. No good leader is just going to jump into a fray with a blindfold on and hope we don't all come out looking like Lieutenant Dan. In the last segment, it's kind of a finisher to an extremely long piece in the book on the condemnation of slavery, where he says, quote, "If resolutions were passed in condemnation thereof," that being slavery, "and if sermons and resolutions were published in American papers or distributed over the country in pamphlet form, let none think that Christian America presents such work as interference. If any were to object, they would not be Christians. All Christ's men will welcome gladly and gratefully the influence of such work as a gift from God, and will be made stronger to discharge successfully the divine duties they have undertaken." Thus he is saying that if non-Christians, people that simply abhorred the thought of slavery or what was going on in the country, were to work toward abolishing slavery, all true Christians would be for it. So those guys he cited earlier in the churches and the religious peoples, quote unquote, that were working with the slave trade and for the slave trade to their own benefit, some would say detriment, he's saying those were not true Christians. Throughout the entire book, that it really is his theme. The people that freed the slaves were not the black people, they weren't the white people, they weren't the politicians. To some effect, they weren't even really the people that fought and died in the Civil War. They were the pious, they were the Christians, they were the people who were sick of the depravity of the trade and all the actions therein. With that history in mind, we're going to continue into some more current things. For example, while everyone applauds the fact that slavery is no longer legal in America and the majority of the world, there's actually still a lot of slaves. According to elo.org, there's approximately 50 million slaves around the world in 2023. And about half of that, 27.6, 28 million of those are in forced labor. Many of those into forced sexual labor. Many of those in the forced sexual labor are children. To use an example, you have the dailymail.com, where two gay dudes in Atlanta bought a couple boys from an adoption agency and then proceeded to rape them and pimp them out and send videos of them being abused to their friends, as just one example of modern child sex slavery. Now, would it be amazing to completely end all that? Absolutely. But via historical precedents, it's fairly likely that it will not end. And that's not something to say that we should stop trying to end it as a society, but that is to say that there will always be bad people. There will be criminals. They're criminals because they're not following the law. So it's illegal, but they're criminals, so they're not following the law. They don't care. It's the same argument with the guns. You could take away everybody's guns and make guns illegal, but you can't take away guns from criminals because they don't care. That's why they're criminals. And it looks like Stanford is making the argument that you can't ban sin nature or make it illegal. That is ingrained in every human. And the people that are trying to ban or make illegal bad things that are bad for society are basically just ignoring or denying God and the existence of that human sin nature. So through all that history, what we have in essence, the 4th of July is everyone's day of freedom. That is what Frederick Douglass is saying. What is the 4th of July to the slave? Nothing. It's nothing to the slave. However, once you are no longer a slave, it is everything, because that is the foundation of the country. And without that, we don't have a country. So at the point of complete abolition, July 4th becomes everybody's day of freedom. As interestingly enough, Puck's magazine shows in this picture from 1902 the acknowledged diversity of the country coming together for July 4th. So then if July 4th is everyone's day of freedom, at least according to Frederick Douglass and Stanford, what is Juneteenth about? And why is it good and necessary? It's now been made a federal legal holiday, but who wanted it to be a federal legal holiday? And how does it bring the country together? So a little more history on that. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 laid out certain criteria for the freeing of slaves during the Civil War. And, as some people have said, from the Emancipation Proclamation to the last slaves being freed was about 2.5 years, which seems like an immeasurable amount of time. That's crazy. It took 2.5 years for that to get around the country. That seems like a long time. I know they didn't have email, cars, planes, anything of that speedy of a nature as we have now, but you'd think it would take a little less time to get around. Here's what they're leaving out. From the end of the war, because keep in mind, the Union is fighting the Confederates throughout those 2.5 years. So from the end of the war, it was 2.5 months before the Union military reached Galveston, Texas, and enforced the Emancipation Proclamation and freed the slaves. So it was not 2.5 years they sat around in slavery. It was more 2.5 months. And I say that because if you're fighting a war, are you going to move your whole army away from the lines to send them halfway across the country to tell people that they're free? And then cede the entire nation because that will allow a sweeping takeover from the Confederates to the rest of the country? No, of course you're not. That's the stupidest strategy anybody could ever come up with, and they did not follow that. So in the 2.5 years, there were slaves freed under the Emancipation Proclamation. Texas was not, because they were basically the farthest point away from everything going on. And of course the the Confederates, didn't just let the slaves go because somebody said so. They had to be forced. So you see there, it wasn't that they didn't tell Texas that the slaves were free. It wasn't that they didn't care that there were enslaved people in Texas, but there were not the resources to send Union troops down there in force and make them do it. Even after Union troops moved into the area and enforced the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of the Texans still tried to rise up and say that either we're not going to do it or that all black people are going to die because the only thing keeping them alive is slavery. Now, in all this talk, I would be amiss to leave out possibly one of the most adorable old ladies I've ever seen in my life. Her name is Opal Lee, and apparently she's classed as the grandmother of Juneteenth. She has been quoted as saying in an interview regarding the making of Juneteenth a national holiday, and now we can all finally celebrate, the whole country together. And while that's an interesting idea, why couldn't we celebrate together the 4th of July? But here's a video of her at the White House Juneteenth celebration 2023.
Hello, young people. And no, you are all not young people if you're not 96. Please, could I just say this to you young folk? Make yourself a committee of one to change somebody's mind. If people can be taught to hate, they can be taught to love. And it's up to you to do it. We are the most powerful country in the whole United States. And we must get together and get rid of the disparities, the joblessness and homelessness and health care that some people can get and others can't, and climate change that we are responsible for. And if we don't do something about it, we're all going to hell in a handbasket.
And with that, And with that, I thank you, Ms. Opal Lee, for your years of advocacy, leadership, and truth-telling. Happy Juneteenth to everyone. May God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
As I said, pretty adorable. Now, she was a preserver of history, which I am an advocate for. Preserve all history, good or bad, such as the satanic abortion rituals that the Church of Satan is currently battling in court to use as a religious right to abort children, and in some cases be in the room for the ritual as the child is being aborted. Now, here's a video by the Democratic Party that gives a rundown about their ideals regarding Juneteenth. As you can see, that video left out a lot of actual history, whereas it says it was 2.5 years. They just kind of left him there. They forgot to say that, oh, there was a war going on, and there simply was not the people to go and enforce, so they couldn't police the entirety of the country, because otherwise they would have lost the Union. The Confederates would have invaded the North, they would have taken over everything, and while they would have gone and freed the slaves out in Texas, all the slaves around the entire country, because the Union would have been lost, would have been rounded up and re-enslaved. So it would have been foolish for them to forcibly send someone out to Galveston to make them submit and free the slaves instead of fighting the war and doing it as soon as possible, which in this case was about 2.5 months after basically all the fighting stopped. Because even at the point of treaty, all the fighting did not stop. There were still skirmishes and other small battles going on that had to be wrapped up. I believe it was more like 3 weeks. So now I'd like to see some of the merchandise that has been put out for Juneteenth, because some of it is pretty ridiculous and most of it argues with itself. And that I find kind of odd. Some of the items for Juneteenth don't make a whole lot of sense. One being this t-shirt, Juneteenth, Black King, and nutrition facts. So I'm gonna start at the bottom here. Leadership, maybe anyone wearing that shirt is an amazing leader. Okay, sure. Intelligence, 100%. Really? That's quite a claim. So anybody wearing this shirt is claiming that they are 100% genius above anyone else. Even the most intellectual people in known history are not 100% intelligent. Consciousness, 100%. Well, that's not true, because at least a third of your life, you are not conscious. So that's another odd thing to put on there. Foolishness, 0%. Well, that's just foolish. Are you saying you have no jokes? There's no free playtime? You're 100% serious all the time? You're a very boring person. And then melanin, 100%. Kind of sounds like a vitamin in that format. But then again, that's incorrect also, because most people with any sort of color that isn't pasty white don't have 100% melanin. That's basically pitch black. So these are all just really weird claims. The most weird being a black king. Now I'm assuming, because there's a big Africa outline in the shirt, that they mean black African king. Well, if you're celebrating Juneteenth, which is an American holiday now, then you're not an African king, you're a Afro-American king? Which is a humorous claim to me, because I've actually worked with African kings, 2 to be exact, and an African prince. So they claimed they didn't really have documentation, like tribal papers, entitled, "Oh, I just can't wait to be," and then you filled in the blank, and you just wrote in king. The next one is extraordinarily confusing, because it says July 4th, 1776, not quite free. Okay, we've been over the history, that makes sense. January 1st, 1863, almost free. Well, that also makes sense, because we've already been over that the Union Army could not stretch itself across the entirety of the nation immediately and free all the slaves at the exact same time. So, almost free. Yeah, okay. Took a little time. But the confusing part is June 19th, 1865, free-ish. Well, that gives precedence that you're still enslaved, even though the Emancipation Proclamation freed you from slavery, and you're having a Juneteenth celebration to say that you are free. So are you free or you're not free? You do have to make up your mind. Here's another free-ish. And of course, I'll add a comment, because we know what free-ish means. We have all the previous stated racial epithets about all the laws are set up to suppress the masses, primarily the masses of colored people. I disagree with that, of course, but I guess that's what this shirt is based on. And then we have this argument to the previous shirts of Juneteenth, freedom since 1865. So according to this shirt, we are not free-ish, we are freedom. Need to get your story straight. So now we'll get into some of the people who are working for the dissolution of the country. We're going to start with Nikole Hannah-Jones, the 1619 Project creator, who won a Pulitzer Prize for said project, and by the way, was very quickly afterward completely debunked by a mess of historians who said that most of the jargon she was yibbering about was completely incorrect. But the New York Times, the organization that paid for the project's creation, states about the project that it, quotes, aims to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the center of our national narrative. They also go on to present a segment of Nikole Hannah-Jones' article in the project, that which I will now read. She writes, quote, "The United States is a nation founded on both an ideal and a lie. Our Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4, 1776, proclaims that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. But the white men who drafted those words did not believe them to be true for the hundreds of thousands of black people in their midst. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness did not apply to fully 1/5 of the country. Yet despite being violently denied the freedom and justice promised to all, Black Americans believed fervently in the American creed." So we'll take a pause there and look at what she says about the nation being founded on an ideal. First off, ideal is based on an idea. Everything in history is based on an idea. Some of those are good, some of those are bad. In our current state of existence, even with inflation and shortages at various points, the idea seems to be a pretty good one. It did take a while to come into a more full fruition, but the idea itself, most people would agree, was a pretty good one. And of course, the statement that the white men who drafted those words did not believe them, I previously debunked with the historical documents from that era, and so that's just a straight up lie. But while it is true that until the Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War, that the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness did not apply to 1/5 of the country, but she goes on to insult black Americans by saying basically they're terrible, awful, no good, very bad people, because while they were enslaved and being denied the justice promised to all, these silly, stupid black American slaves fervently still believed in the American creed. So she can't figure out why they would do that. You're enslaved, but you believe in the American creed? You're holding that as a promise that one day you will be freed? How dumb are you? Says Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project. She continues oddly, quote, without the idealistic, strenuous, and patriotic efforts of black Americans, our democracy today would most likely look very different. It might not be a democracy at all. Well, of course, I find that odd, because she's saying there that if there were never any black feet upon the soil, white Americans would just have died out and fallen away. Even though only 1.4% of the country actually owned slaves, even at the peak of slavery, and thus 98.6% of America did not, apparently 98.6% of America could not take care of itself and survive. And of course, she's throwing out that it would not be a democracy at all, which is probably nonsense, since technically it's never been a democracy. It was designed to be a democratic republic. Another lazy, spoiled brat is Emily Del Carmen Ramirez. She wrote an article in 2019 for peaceisloud.org called "We Need to Talk About How July 4th Isn't My Independence Day." This one is a little odd because she claims to be a Dominican American, first generation. So she doesn't exactly fall under the black slavery of America. And America took in her grandparents and mother, and according to her, they found a better life than in the Dominican. But still she says, quote, Independence Day is here, and I once again find myself questioning who July 4th is for. I know 3 things about the holiday. 1, it celebrates the independence of white men in America, as most American traditions repeatedly do. 2, my entire life, it was taught to me as a celebration of freedom. And 3, it is not mine. She goes on to say, till this day, I see American freedom on July 4th as the capitalist belief that working hard can afford us better lives. You have to sweat for financial freedom, and America provides that opportunity. Now that is a snippet out of all the drivel on either side of it, because that's really what matters. The base idea of it is she had a hard life growing up, which most people did, so get over yourself. And now she has to have a job and work and pay for things. She's not just sent a check and provided a place to sit around all day, which I can see how that would be a great burden upon her. The last person I'll cite is the president, Jill Biden. Sorry. Not Jill Biden. Oh man, that's my bad. All right. I'll correct that. No, the last person is Mr. McStumbles, the big guy himself, President Joe Biden. He's the one who signed the Juneteenth National Independence Day Act, or S.475, on June 17th, 2021. But why did he do that? Especially since he's fairly notorious for being openly racist. So why would he do something for the extreme benefit of the black community? Well, let's see if any of my favorite video clips from Joe Biden's comments in the past give any insight as to his endeavors.
I mean, you got the first sort of mainstream African American who was articulate and bright and clean and a nice-looking guy. I mean, that's a storybook, man.
Ah, so Obama is the first clean black guy. That's good.
Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids.
Are they now, Joe? Poor kids. Just as good as white kids.
But I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
That sounds like one of those black white supremacist thing. You might be black, but you're not actually black if you don't vote for Joe.
They're gonna put you all back in chains.
My favorite part there is the booing when he's telling the people in the audience that the Republicans are going to put you all back in chains. Perhaps he's lost a few synapses and he doesn't remember that it was the Democratic Republicans that were the majority that had black people in chains, and they just dropped the Republicans. And then here's a clip from our sainted Vice President Harris at the 2023 Juneteenth concert making the glorious claim that this administration has appointed the most black judges to the federal appellate court, including Ketanji Brown Jackson.
In addition, since we took office, we have appointed more black judges to the federal appellate bench than any administration in history. Yes, including the first black woman to sit on the highest court in our land. Her name is Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson.
I don't know about you, but I personally have no beef, any sort of background, color of any of the judges. But if the black judges that have been appointed to the federal appellate court are anything like Ketanji Brown Jackson, who, by the way, if you don't recall, cannot describe what a woman is, that's not great. Give me a few Clarence Thomases? Great. Someone articulate, knows what he's talking about, and has some sort of moral foundation? Awesome. If you can't tell me what a woman is, you probably shouldn't be making world-changing decisions. Now to drive home the point that Juneteenth is generally and essentially a grift, Reuters.com has an article called Juneteenth Merchandise Turns Off Some Shoppers. Quote, Dollar Tree Juneteenth decorations are manufactured by vendors who aren't descendants of slaves themselves, according to the National Assembly of American Slavery Descendants, an advocacy group that supports reparations for Black American descendants of slavery. So one way or another, we have to figure out who's an ancestor of a slave. And of course, they're advocating for reparations in addition. But also, everything for Juneteenth has to be manufactured by descendants of slaves. Doesn't matter what they do, doesn't matter where they live, they must be the ones to make them, or there's no point in making Juneteenth merchandise. Later on in the article, it cites Connie Ross, Vice President and Chair of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at Empower Consultancy, said, quote, Walmart and other brands should use the holiday to promote black vendors. Juneteenth was not born out of a pretty story, but give it time, and people are going to find a way to associate it with something positive. Which I, of course, agree with her, because Juneteenth was not born out of a pretty story. Those people in Texas had to wait 2.5 years for a war to end. And true, give it time. Oh wait, we gave it time, and people have found a way to associate it with something positive, which it is. It actually is something positive. Slavery was legally ended, and the last of the black slaves were freed. Excellent. However, are you saying that we're supposed to be completely negative about Juneteenth? Is it a celebration? Is it a holiday? Or is it just something to look down on potentially white people? Another opinion piece grift by Peniel Jones on CNN.com says, quote, 2020 saw much of the nation embrace Juneteenth as a Black 4th of July celebration. So there we have the appropriation of the 4th of July. And scores of corporations, including the NFL, designated the date a paid holiday as the nation scrambled to respond to the monumental calls for racial justice. No, I think the NFL and scores of corporations were scrambling to concede to demands so they didn't get burned to the ground. He continues on, quote, for me, Juneteenth is the answer to Frederick Douglass's towering 1852 address, What to the Slave is the 4th of July? In Rochester, New York, Douglass, an enslaved black man turned abolitionist, newspaper editor and publisher, and outspoken civil rights activist, rallied against the hypocrisy of a nation that dared to celebrate an ideal of freedom in an age of chattel slavery. Well, we already went through that address, and of course this guy is an uneducated twit, because Juneteenth is not the answer to that. In fact, I could find nothing that Frederick Douglass actually said about Juneteenth, because it would seem that the question in his address, what to the slave is the 4th of July, was answered by the complete abolition of slavery in America. At least that's what the speech was saying itself. The last grifter I have to offer is the most recent, and her name is Cori Bush, Congresswoman representing St. Louis. And she presented a couple tweets about Juneteenth on the day of. She says in these tweets, quote, it's Juneteenth and reparations. It's Juneteenth and end police violence and the war on drugs. It's Juneteenth and end housing and education apartheid. It's Juneteenth and teach the truth about white supremacy in our country. Black liberation must be prioritized. She followed that up later in response to a Josh Hawley tweet about essentially Christianity saved America and freed the slaves, as also Stanford, in his book in the 1800s, stated himself. But to that she responds, quote, 1. Today is a good day to remember. America was built on the enslavement of black people, which is a 1619 Project trope. And 2, our government has never even formally apologized, let alone sought to repair the harms slavery inflicted and perpetuated. Now keep in mind, I believe this was the woman that was advocating for $14 trillion in reparation. But according to everything we've gone over here, England and the US, primarily the US, in this discussion, have met Frederick Douglass's criteria. Thomas Stanford pretty much sees it how it is, and praises both countries, England and US, and those who he sees as being the actual liberators, as Christians who fought with a moral foundation against the authorized tragedy of slavery. Juneteenth isn't directly bad to celebrate. It's not something to look down on. Oh, we can't celebrate the last enslaved people and slave people being free in America. No, I mean, that's a good thing to celebrate. But the question here is, should it be a national holiday? And that's a really big question to answer. The problem is the majority of the people that keep screaming about our democracy, our sacred democracy. You notice most of them aren't saying our sacred democratic republic, which is what the United States foundationally is. They're saying just democracy. Well, if you have just democracy, then you have people voting for people, and those people get in office, and then they do whatever they want, which, to expound upon the definition, would be democratic oligarchy. If you vote for someone, they get in office, they do whatever they want, they don't care what you have to say about it, you were just the one who chose that specific person to be in office, then it becomes a democratic oligarchy. They're just doing whatever they want. And the cadre of the people that are running the country right now, some would say directly into the ground, do definitely believe in a democracy. They want to pour money into things, they want to make themselves well known, they want to put on a good face, and then they want to do whatever the hell they want. And it should be in the forefront of your mind that there are other ways to suppress and enslave using different words, in fact, correct words, but in euphemistic ways. And as most of us can see through COVID, they aren't just doing it for any specific class of people. It's not a color, it's not a class, it's everyone. And it's not just the adults. Like Joe Biden heading toward a young girl's hair, they're closing in on the children, so be ready. I think that'll do it. So thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow, and thought to you later. Ooh, credits. My favorite. What do we got on the menu today?
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
Casual Reality is a production of Casual Media, LLC, copyright 2023.